going door to door to do the canvassing. So I think they're trying to do things. It's just a question of how organized are they, and how can we get in front of them to present our Cuba stuff. And that's what we're working on now. Verbena was on the call as well. She got to see the comedy of errors. But we met afterwards, Jason and I, Verbena and Sarah and Kelly, we met on, yesterday to decide an approach to that commission. That commission has at least maybe a third to a half or doctors or people that are in various departments of various institutions. And we need to win them over. If we can't win them over, we're not going to win over Whitmer. She's going to just direct everything to that. But they're going to be in meeting for once a week till 6 months after the emergency's over. So we've got time.
Whenever the emergency is over.
Well, it's still got 6 months. So
yeah.
You know, Alice sent me the name of a guy who's a Mark Hurlbut, who's another epidemiologist who's going to be the one working on the water case. Now, he agreed to work on it. Let me send you his information. He has a lot of experience in Africa, in the Caribbean. And he made, when I looked at his resume, I asked Alice if he was black or white. He's white, but it sounded like he may be more open to the Cuba stuff and more knowledgeable about it than like Kilgore was. And I'll send you, but I don't think I can approach him because I'm kind of, you know what I mean? I'm dealing with him through Alice on the water stuff. Maybe I'll send the information to people. Then you might want to consider an independent approach.
Okay.
Do an independent approach to the guy. I just you'll see I'll send you his CV. You'll see why it kind of, I mean, he's done stuff in the Caribbean and all over the world. So my sense is, therefore, he may be more familiar with Cuba.
Okay.
His name is Hurlbut, I think, Mark Hurlbut.
I don't remember hardly any names of people on the commission.
He's not on the commission. Okay. I didn't notice his name on the commission.
Well, what's interesting is that I know the television seemed to be playing down the death threats against Whitmer and Nessel. I know in some of the print media, they have details on who the suspect is and his background, a little bit about the background. Yeah, it's interesting that last night, from what I saw, they did mention it, but they really didn't dwell on it a lot.
I saw his picture on TV. He sounds like they did talk about it a little bit about his background and his former employers.
Yeah.
Who acknowledged that he was a little off base. They claim, the people that know him claim that there's something going on with him mentally. Mm-hmm. Of course, for white people, that's a way to get him out of terrorism charges.
Right. Yeah, I was wondering if he belonged to some type of white supremacist or neo-fascist group.
Yeah, he might, but he was a downtown realtor, downtown Detroit realtor.
Right. And it kind of fits in to what's happening in the city in terms of how the administration itself, the land bank, and also the capitalists are approaching the situation in Detroit for some time now. Yeah, so it's quite interesting. So we can get started now. Is everybody ready?
I just want to real quick, can I just
go ahead?
Sure everyone's aware that we are streaming to YouTube. So just so you know that. If you don't want to appear on YouTube, probably just mute your camera. But yeah, we're live right now.
Okay.
All right. Well, I want to welcome everybody to this class. This is part of the series of Communist Workers League Marxism classes. We've been holding them for a long time. And normally they're live at our office, face-to-face classes, interaction. We usually have food before we begin the class. We can't do that today. We can eat, individually, We can't have a collective meal together, unfortunately. But we'll get back there sooner, if not later. I want to thank all of the comrades and friends who have maintained their focus over the last 2 months. We've never had to deal with a situation like this, as far as I know, in terms of the movement here in Detroit. We've dealt with a lot of repression. We've dealt with a lot of economic attacks, but this is on a different level, although it has repressive elements as well as a strong economic undertone to all of this, which ties into our topic today. But first, does anyone have any announcements? We have a meeting coming up on Monday, and we also have a special event on Thursday. Does anyone want to report on that?
Well, I can say some, yeah, we're gonna have.
David raised his hand.
Oh,
All right.
pardon?
Go ahead, Michael.
Both.
Oh, no, go ahead. I didn't see the hand raised. I'll step back.
That's okay. So Monday is our regular organizational meeting of the Moratorium Now Coalition, 7 p.m. And where we're taking up a lot of different issues, including fighting to get Cuban doctors and/or medicine into the Michigan area. On Thursday, we have a special meeting. Moratorium Now is holding a special meeting with the editor of the Orinoco Tribune, Jesus Rodriguez Espinosa, former consul general to Chicago for the Venezuelan revolutionary government, and now living in Venezuela. And that's going to be 7 o'clock Thursday, the 21st. You have to pre-register. There's a Facebook page for it, and we'd like you to get it out as widely as possible. It's not specific to Michigan, although we initiated this and we had very good relations with Jesus for the years when he was here. And even when he went back, he would do Skype meetings for us. It was prompted by the mercenary invasion of Venezuela on May 3rd, 4th, and which was smashed, but they're expecting more of them. And of course, it's traced right back to the US, and the Trump administration has dirty hands in this also. So, but you have to register for those meetings. And anyway, please do so and share it widely.
Yeah, Jesus is a good friend of ours, and he used to frequently visit Detroit when he was stationed at the Bolivarian Venezuelan consulate in Chicago. He would drive up on his own to speak to us at various meetings, conferences, and then all of a sudden his credentials were withdrawn, along with a lot of other people who represented the revolutionary government in Venezuela. They have recognized the government, the US government has recognized someone as president who never even stood for elections, who's corrupt, has been proven to be corrupt, yet he's still being recognized by US imperialism as the president of Venezuela. And this has prevented Venezuela just recently from getting a loan from the International Monetary Fund to assist the COVID-19 mitigation efforts in Venezuela, because the IMF is based in Washington, D.C., and it was established by the United States during the period at the conclusion of World War II. The IMF told the Venezuelan government that there was a question about who was a legitimate authority in the country, so therefore they could not loan money to President Maduro's government. So this is totally outrageous. So we're going to look forward to hearing from Jesus this coming week. Are there any other announcements?
I have my hand up.
Go
I have
ahead.
a couple.
Oops. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Is someone calling on people or who's doing?
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Couple of one is there was a really good car caravan. It was about 65 cars on I believe it was Thursday over the demand canceled to rent the rents. It was very strong. I mean, literally the cars were lined up from downtown all the way to the state building, and then we circled the state building. And then the same day there was a call-in done to Whitmer from I believe Detroit Renter City and Black Lives in Detroit did a call-in thing. And that night, Whitmer extended the eviction moratorium to June 13th. So it was a victory. It was pretty clear. She did it at 9:25 at night. So it was pretty clearly a response to the action. So it was really a big victory. The other thing that this week that's of note is that was a settlement's been announced in the case of the Detroit, the constitutional case around right to literacy. I don't want to go into a discussion of it because there's elements that are, I mean, it's very positive from the point of view that it's an attempt, I think, to cement that court decision, which is at least law, which is the historic decision in terms of the first decision ever in the U.S. saying that access to literacy is a constitutional right under the U.S. Constitution. But the remedies are pretty limited that it suggests. Even VD published a letter that I shared on the moratorium page saying how, you know, what's needed is a lot more than's talked about there. But at the same time, I think we need to, you know, think about how we want to approach it publicly. But I think overall, it's definitely a victory for the struggle and for the right to students to access to literacy, and should be seen in that light. And as a beginning in really approaching this, implementing this, which is of course going to be very difficult in light of the, I think there's $3.2 billion in state cuts were announced today, including $1.2 billion in education, or deficit of that much.
Yeah, thanks for that update. Maybe Monday at the Moratorium Now meeting, we can get more into detail.
Okay.
But yes, I think it's, you know, one of the most important decisions related to civil rights probably in 30 years
Right.
in the United States. You know, civil rights law has been so bad since the 1980s in particular, so many setbacks, or even going back to the 70s, you know, with the Bakke case, Bradley versus Milliken in 74, the Bakke case in 78. So yeah, it's been decades of setbacks. Yeah, and I wrote just this week about the imminent budget cuts in the state. That's going to be at least 25% cut in school funding, as if it wasn't bad enough already in Detroit, as well as a lot of the suburban districts and rural districts as well. So we're in for a big struggle around education in the state of Michigan. Yep. Any other announcements? Well, I guess we can get started. This is a very, very interesting book. We have read Walter Rodney for years, particularly his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which was published when he was a professor in Tanzania in East Africa in 1972. That's when it was first published. And then 2 years later, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa was published by Howard University Press in 1974. So during that time period, the 1970s into the 1980s and since then, it's been a popular book among African-American leftists, people all over Africa, the left in general have, of course, read this book. Rodney was born in Guyana, which is in South America. It's considered a part of the Caribbean, the Black Caribbean, meaning like Jamaica, Grenada, Barbados, Trinidad, Tobago. So a lot of the Africans, people of African descent who come from that region, identify as being African Caribbeans, having a distinctive cultural element as a result largely of British colonialism and imperialism. The Africans there, of course, just like in North America, were brought there during slavery. And there was huge slavery in South America, even before in North America. Brazil, for example, they had slavery there beginning even in the 1500s. So that's the 16th century under the Portuguese. And then, of course, the Spanish were in the Western Hemisphere in the 16th century. They were even in what's considered now the United States, in Florida, during the 1500s, and actually had engaged in slavery there during the 1500s, even prior to the British, beginning in 1619, which we commemorated the 400th anniversary of the British enslavement of African people in North America last year. Now, it was a big deal. Even the New York Times put out a supplement magazine commemorating the 400th anniversary of the enslavement of African people. Ghana in West Africa, which has a history of Pan-Africanism and progressive politics, particularly under Kwame Nkrumah in the 50s and 60s, invited people of African descent to visit Ghana last year, and thousands upon thousands went. Hundreds of people were even given passports so they could have dual citizenship with the United States as well as Ghana, or Caribbean countries in Ghana as well. So the Caribbean, as a result of that history of enslavement and colonialism, produced a lot of revolutionary fighters. There were rebellions against slavery in the Caribbean, just like they were in North America. The demographics became different in the Caribbean because there were far fewer British settlers there. So the Africans far outnumbered the Europeans. And the French, the colonies they had was the same dynamic. So when we had Santo Domingo, which was on the island of Hispaniola, which later became known as Haiti, there was a rebellion, of course, that began and transformed into a revolution from 1791 to 1803, and it was declared a republic in 1804. So that's just one example. In Brazil, the Africans who were enslaved there, a lot of them ran away, rebelled, and formed their own independent communities known as the Quilombos, going all the way back to the 17th century. So Walter Rodney was born in 1942. He came out of the Caribbean. His parents were working class people. They were progressive people. They belonged to a party, the Progressive People's Party, the PPP, which was headed by a guy named Shetty Jagan, who was of Asian descent. He was Guyanese of Asian descent. And that party was allied during that time period in the 1950s, and even afterwards, had very close ties with the Soviet Union. So Rodney's parents were members of this party. And he went to school in Guyana. Later, he went to the University of the West Indies, and then got a bachelor's degree. And then he went to the School of Oriental and African Studies, which is connected with the London University. And this was in 1963 when he arrived there to work on a PhD in African history. So in 1963, of course, there was so much ferment politically in Africa and in the Black world in general. You had the civil rights movement in the United States that was reaching new heights every year. You had the African liberation movements taking place. You had liberation movements in the Caribbean. The Cuban Revolution had taken place in 1959. So Rodney was influenced by all these developments that were going on. So when he went to England in 1963, he became acquainted with CLR James, who was another African historian from Trinidad. And James was a Marxist as well. He was born in Trinidad in 1901. He went to live in England around 1932, and he joined the Trotskyist movement in its early days in England, and did a lot of writing within the movement there. And in 1938, 1939, he came to the United States to do a lecture tour, and of course, wound up staying for 15 years, worked heavily with the Socialist Workers' Party and other Trotskyist, Marxists, and Black organizations. So when Walter Rodney went to London in 1963, he met CLR James and his wife at the time, Selma James. They became good friends. They were part of study groups and so forth. So Rodney studied there for 3 years. He did research in Portugal on his dissertation, which dealt with the Atlantic slave trade along the Upper Guinea coast in West Africa. And he did a lot of primary source research for his dissertation. He had to learn how to speak Portuguese because he wanted to go through all those historical documents going back to the 15th, 16th century. After he finished his PhD in 1966, he was invited to go to the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. This is in East Africa, which at that time was a center of revolutionary activity in Africa. Tanzania had gained its independence just 5 years before, but during that time period, it had oriented itself heavily towards the People's Republic of China. They had become a base for various liberation movements in Africa. People from South Africa, Namibia, Mozambique, Rhodesia, which became Zimbabwe, were all in Tanzania. They had headquarters there. They engaged in military and political training there and so forth. And the University of Dar es Salaam also was a magnet for progressive left-wing Marxist scholars who went there to teach under this progressive government. 1967, the year after Walter Rodney got to Tanzania, the Tanzanian government, under his political party headed by Julius Nyerere, issued what was called the Arusha Declaration. It was a document calling for the implementation of socialist policies in Tanzania. This was in 1967. So Rodney was teaching there at the university during this time period, interacting with liberation movements, interacting with people from other socialist states who were living in Tanzania, who was visiting Tanzania. And during that time period, he started to develop courses in the history department, numerous courses. And one of the courses he developed was a history of the Russian Revolution. This course was initially delivered in 1970, 1971 at the university. And his lectures were written out. And hence we have this book today. It was not published during the 1970s. I became aware of these lectures about over 25 years ago. I met this guy who was a professor at Eastern Michigan University. He was from Uganda, which is a neighboring country of Tanzania. And he had been a student at the University of Dar es Salaam in the early 1970s. And he had studied under Walter Rodney. And he mentioned to me in a conversation that Walter Rodney had done a course on the history of the Russian Revolution, and that the manuscripts, had been circulated at the time, but they were never really published. So I was very interested, in what Rodney had to say about the Russian Revolution, the history of it. It wasn't until 2 years ago I heard that this book had finally been published by the Walter Rodney Foundation in Atlanta, that's headed by his widow, who has spoken here in Detroit a few years ago. So anyway, this is how the book came about. The manuscripts are about 50 years old, amazingly. So that's just some background information on how this book actually came about. So now the problem with with us doing this class is that the book is not, how should I say, the book is not on, I could not find necessarily a document, a PDF document for the book. I went to the Amazon page for that advertises the book, of course. You can open up the book on Amazon, and the first chapter, which we want to get into, it can be read there. Now, what's interesting about this is that the whole situation with this book is that there are several people, 2-3 people who wrote introductions to the book and so forth. I don't think we need to read that, to be honest. 2 of the people, one of them, Prasad, Vijay Prasad, I've met him. He's an academic. You know, he writes some good stuff. And Robin Kelly, who used to teach at the University of Michigan, I've met him too many, many years ago. But, you know, we want to get into what Rodney said himself, you know, about the Russian Revolution, his own research. You know, I guess it's like a lot of books. For example, readers that deal with Lenin, Marx, even Trotsky. Sometimes it's best just to read the actual historical documents from these revolutionary thinkers. You can go back and read the interpretations or the misinterpretations of what they did. But you know, if we start, I want us to start in the first chapter, which is the 2 worldviews of the Russian Revolution. Now, if you go to the link in the Facebook page and click on the link to the book, you go about to the 2nd or 3rd page, which is the index of the book. If you don't have the book in front of you, you can go to the 2nd or 3rd page to the index of the book. And in the index, you can click on the first chapter, which is the 2 worldviews of the Russian Revolution. And it will come up. And we can read it, which is very good if we could do that. Even though this book is being sold commercially, sections of it is available for the general public to read. So can everybody access this material that I'm talking about?
Sharon, did you want to ask a question?
I just wanted to say that when I scrolled down on Google, I found the book where that I could put it online. I put it on my phone actually for $9.99.
Wow.
So if anybody wants to do that, just go down on Google's page and you'll see, and you can put it either on an Android or on an Apple device.
Oh, okay.
Great. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
And, you know, people can order the book. I bought it at the African American Museum last year. But of course, the museum is closed now because of the pandemic. Anybody else had anything to ask or say?
Abiyumi, I just want to try to find the link you're talking about. I'm on the Facebook page. And
Okay.
is it the one that goes to the Amazon?
Yeah, go
link?
to the discussion section. I have posted it in there.
Oh, discussion.
And, there should be a link to the Amazon book.
I think it's in the about section.
Oh, about. Okay, sorry.
I'm looking for it.
Yeah. Well, let me just say before I start reading, the first chapter of the book is very interesting because even though the book is about the history of the Russian Revolution, Rodney starts out discussing the significance of the Russian Revolution to the African Revolution and to African people in general. So it's a very interesting introductory chapter.
Are you talking about like on Amazon where you can click and preview the book?
Yes.
That kind of thing?
Yeah. Yeah, if you click it open to preview the book, and you go to, I think maybe the second or third page, there's the index. And in the index, you should be able to click open the first chapter, which is the two world views of the Russian Revolution.
Okay, I found it.
You found it?
Yeah. Do you want me to share my screen?
Yeah, you could.
Can you see that?
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Great. Okay. Well, let me start by saying this particular chapter starts out with a quote from Mao Zedong, interestingly enough. That's how it starts out. And it says, throughout the history of human knowledge, have been two conceptions concerning the law of development of the universe, the metaphysical conception and the dialectical conception, which form two opposing world outlooks. That's according to Chairman Mao Zedong from the Essay on Contradictions from 1937. So he starts out with a quote from Mao Zedong. Then Rodney starts, he says, in the era from the confrontation with colonial rule in the 1950s and 1960s, through the process of decolonization, African scholars have resolved a number of issues. First, African history and society became a legitimate field of inquiry. Second, they have emphasized the need to counter the racist, colonialist orientation that predominated within the little that had previously been written. Third, they have given primacy to interpretation by Africans themselves. But this is very, very important, these 3 points that he's making. This was written in 1970, okay? This is right in the aftermath of the post-World War II explosion in liberation movements, civil rights movements, revolutionary movements around the world. For example, the Korean Revolution after 1945, consolidating in 1948. The Vietnamese Revolution of 1945, the defeat of French imperialism in 1954. It goes on and on, the Bandung Conference of 1955 and so forth. All these developments impacted Black people throughout the world. And of course, the points he's raising is that African studies during that period established itself as a legitimate field of study. You know, in the Western world, in the past, there were people that said there was no such thing as African history. But that, you know, there was no African history, that African people had never accomplished anything. And that only when they were brought to the West as slaves did they have any form of civilization. Well, this is totally ridiculous. I mean, even the ancient Greeks, if you read people like Herodotus and others, knew of the various aspects of African civilization and African history, going back several thousand years. But this had to be, as a result of slavery and colonialism, this had to be reinforced, of course, through struggle, proper struggles, labor struggles, and indeed armed struggles as well. So it's very, very important that Rodney begins by talking about how the whole development of African history took place. So he goes on to say a similar and even more determined effort to overturn racist interpretations of history was made by African descendants in the New World. When he says the New World, he means the Western Hemisphere, notably in the United States. This work is the basis for the proliferation of Black studies programs and is responsible for the demand that as far back Black people are concerned, white people are historically disqualified from interpreting Black folks to Black folks. Consequently, the term African perspective and or Black perspective and we need to move the Black perspective have emerged from both the continent and the diaspora. The concept of, quote, African perspective is much broader than those of African history, African society, and African culture. An African scholar naturally designates activity by Africans as his primary field of study, but it does not take very long to discover that he or she is obligated to arrive at his or her own interpretation of human societies outside of Africa. So this is the point he's making. You have an African perspective on African history and African society, but that informs people as an African person what your perspective is in regard to events that are developing in other parts of the world. Meaning that based upon the history of African people and their struggles, they have a particular orientation in their worldview, not just impacting Black people themselves. He goes on to say at the University of the West Indies, Ibadan, which is in Nigeria, Dar es Salaam, which of course is in Tanzania, where he's writing this. For example, the normal demands of teaching led rapidly to the decision that the local staff should not merely master local affairs, but should replace Europeans presenting and interpreting Europe to Africa and initiate the study of Asia so as to provide our own people with a global perspective. So what he's saying essentially is that Black people could become experts in Asian affairs, in European affairs, or whatever. And they could bring their own perspective to all these developments. So this is a pretty radical view if we consider the fact that within academia itself, the racism that existed there was so strong that they were even saying that there was no legitimate field of Black studies or African studies. Even during the 1950s and 60s, there was this whole debate that was raging on the campuses. And it had to be protests, building takeovers, like what happened at San Francisco State University in 1968-69, what happened at U of M in 1970, on and on. It happened at Wayne State, where I attended university. So history, academics, intellectual pursuit became political questions. They became terrains of political struggle. And I think he's articulating this in these first passages of the first chapter of this book. So are there any questions or comments on this so far?
Nope, you're doing great.
Okay, okay. All right. Well, we can read a few more paragraphs from this. Does anybody else want to read? It was not long ago that paragraph. It was not long ago that we in textbooks designed for Africans meant we the British.
I'll read.
Go ahead.
Okay. It was not so long ago that we in textbooks designed for Africans meant we the British or we the French. Conversely, they referred to Africans, which posed a crisis of identity, even when they, the Africans, are not referred to as savages or natives. This point hardly needs discussion with regard to studies of Africa itself, where the battle for an African identity has already been fought and won in principle. But looking at the outside world is necessary to underscore the new realization that Africans are, quote unquote, we, and that we have to interpret the totality of human existence. At the simplest level, an African account of, say, Australia or Switzerland written for Africans would demonstrate the characteristics of relating the foreign and unknown phenomenon to what is familiar in Africa. That is a very normal procedure. When the Dutch went to Benin in the 17th century, they exclaimed that Benin City was comparable to the best that Holland had to offer. Similarly, all Europeans compare Shaka to Napoleon, Dahomey to Sparta, and so on. Of course, for the present generation of educated Africans, a European parallel comes to mind more quickly than an African one. Nevertheless, the time will probably come when African teachers will make 17th century European feudalism more readily comprehensible to African students by pointing to similarities and contrasts in 14th century Ethiopia. Should I keep going?
Yeah, are there any questions or comments on that section? It's quite interesting that he points out that despite all the propaganda that was utilized by European colonialism, and all of this was done to justify slavery, to justify colonialism, to justify Jim Crow and other forms of legalized discrimination. He's pointing out that if you go back to a lot of the initial primary source documents, the actual records of Europeans interacting with African people, it reads quite differently. And he provides these examples. Benin, which at that time was known as Dahomey, being comparable to cities in Europe during the period of the onslaught of European enslavement and colonialism in Africa. So this is a very, very important point that he's raising. Any comments or questions on this section? If not, you can go ahead, Jason. Yeah, go ahead.
In initiating a study of the world at large, the African scholar or student can exercise choice, something that was impossible under colonialism. The colonized African did not merely study Europe. He concentrated heavily, sometimes exclusively, on the mother country. The opening of the options allows for the establishment of priorities of relevance. In any event, the history of Europe or of a given European country from the 15th century to the present has had to give way to courses on African history. Therefore, what remains outside of African consciousness has to be rigorously studied. There is no need to justify the selection. Understanding the Soviet Union is a priority that is self-evident. Some awareness of the Soviet Union has seeped into the African consciousness, occasionally through direct tutoring among the educated, and more usually by inference and occasional references in different contexts. Both the books and the indirect references come from the colonizer to the colonized. The colonizer had national and ideological conflicts with the Soviet Union. Indeed, they were self-declared enemies. Therefore, A was interpreting his enemy, B, to his third party, C, which happens to be comprised of Africans. In the best of circumstances, such a procedure would be questionable, unless Africans had already agreed that our interests and basic outlooks coincided with those of Europe. As it is, we know for a fact how prejudiced and distorted Europe's view of Africa has been. We know that European capitalism and imperialism continue to have our exploitation as their main objective. There is, therefore, every reason to be suspicious of the Western European and American view of the Soviet Revolution, and there is every reason to seek an African view.
Okay, very important point.
Yeah.
Very important.
Awesome.
Why should African people, any oppressed people, take the view of their oppressors as being legitimate in viewing the oppressor's enemies?
Right.
Very, very important point. Why should African people have a negative view of the Soviet Union based upon the pronouncements and even the writings, even the scholarship of the Western imperialist nations? So he's stating right at the beginning that we're going to look at the Soviet Union from a different perspective. then the US and that Britain would look at the Soviet Union. So he's already saying right there from the beginning that there's going to be a thorough investigation of the actual history of the Soviet Union. Not only that, but what the capitalist and imperialist scholars have said about the Soviet Union and the distortions they promoted, which of course has impacted the oppressed as well. So any questions or comments on that?
Sharon has her hand up.
Go ahead.
I just want to say that I have found him so far to be so brilliant and to be able to speak with such clarity and to open things up in a way that I haven't read before. The ability to take these ideas and to talk about them the way he does is so impressive, and it was a real joy to read his work. That's all.
Well, that's very interesting. You know, even though Rodney was a highly educated person, had a terminal degree in history, studied at a major prestigious British university. A lot of his writings were directed towards working class people,
Right.
students, youth, and people who were involved in the revolutionary struggle. And he was very open about this. So, you know, that's why in academia, some people did try to criticize him back during this time period, to say that he was biased, he was not objective and so forth, you know, which was ridiculous.
Right.
But this is what they say about people who, you know, take a Marxist viewpoint. But not only did he have a Marxist viewpoint, he was an activist. He was very close to like SWAPO and the liberation movements in Africa and other progressive forces around the world. And even in this country, he had very close ties with revolutionary forces. So a lot of times in academia, they do not look favorably upon that when you engage in an activity outside the classroom, outside the lab, when you actually get involved in the day-to-day struggles that people are concerned about. And he made it clear when he wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa that the book largely was directed towards the people, towards the workers, towards the students, and towards the liberation forces. That's what he said. Yep. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Who else wants to read the next section? Where it says in society.
I can read.
Go ahead.
In society, there are a variety of options within systems. To understand a system requires that we analyze both its national expressions and the social forces that shape the environment. The lives of Africans over the last 5 centuries have been affected to varying degrees by forces originating in Europe. Increasingly, Africa became enmeshed in the web of relations that constitute international capitalism, imperialism. The Russian Revolution was the first decisive break away from international capitalism, affecting thereby the subsequent course of events around the world, including Africa. To a certain extent, this inquiry has as a premise that there is such a thing as an African perspective, and hopefully it will be demonstrated that the literature on the Russian Revolution bears out such an assumption. However, it is also possible to test the limits of the assumption by penetrating more deeply into the process of consciousness the process by which individuals in society come to rationalize their social relations and external environment. Hence, it is necessary to introduce at a very early stage the concept of the two worldviews, idealism and materialism, representing fundamentally opposed aspects of consciousness. Continue.
Yeah, you want to go ahead and read the last,
Okay,
that last paragraph?
sure. There is an area of potential conflict that arises by trying to reconcile an African view with the two worldviews. It can be argued that aspects of ideology coming from Europe are irrelevant to the African perspective, or that black world or the black worldview. Conversely, it can and has been said that a worldview is either idealist or materialist, and that the label African conveys no meaning and probably mystifies. That issue can only be resolved in the forces of discussion, and it is my intention to try and avoid prejudgment. However, the very title of this chapter should indicate to the reader that whatever uniqueness one may attach to any given African view, it does not dispense with the necessity to recognize, one, the superiority of materialism over idealism, and two, that materialist views are partial and do not take African perspectives into account.
All right. Yeah, any questions or comments on this section? Okay, let's move on to a preliminary categorization of writers on the Russian Revolution. Now, this section here is very interesting because what he's doing a literature review of various writers who have written on the Russian Revolution. So you have different perspectives on the Russian Revolution. Some Western scholars, even some social democratic scholars, have been highly critical, even condemning the Russian Revolution of 1917, based upon their own political perspectives. So he does a literature review in this section to look at the various perspectives on the Russian Revolution and on Soviet history, which have been contending, or which were contending at that time over those last previous 5 decades. This was written in 1970, 1971. You know, this is quite interesting that he's talking about the Russian Revolution, but he's approaching it from the perspective of an African revolutionary living in a country at that time, which was socialist oriented, and also within the context of the various progressive governments, socialist governments that they had relationships with, and liberation movements as well, which were a part of the ferment in Tanzania at that time. So the next section, a preliminary categorization on the Russian Revolution. Do we have a volunteer to read? Where it says every piece of scholarship is implicitly or explicitly a review of previous work on a given subject.
I will.
Go ahead.
Okay. Every piece of, can you hear me? Because I'm not that
Yes.
close. Okay. Every piece of scholarship is implicitly and explicitly a review of previous work on a given subject. But from time to time, it is also illuminating to direct attention specifically to the nature of existing studies on a particular theme. Historians often resort to this approach as part of a tradition of assessing the scope and limitations of their own discipline. When this is done, the problem that immediately arises is one of categorization. Into what slot can this or that writer be fitted, as a basis for further discussion. Not surprisingly, for the historian, the answer is often to make use of a chronological scale. Assuming that the discussion concerns a set of events that took place at least a century or two ago, then it is relatively simple matter to follow changing patterns and interpretation, starting with contemporaries of the events and moving toward the present. However, when the events are close to the present, a more synchronic approach is unavoidable. This is the situation with regard to the Russian Revolution. Should I continue?
Yeah, please do.
The contrast implied above can best be seen by comparing writings on the Russian Revolution with those on the French Revolution. The mass of material produced by French historians on the central event in their national history falls fairly neatly into chronological eras. In the 19th century, it is possible to distinguish the Restoration from the rest of what was essentially a Republican era. The purposes and preoccupations of historians under the monarchy were quite different from those writers of a later date, even though liberal and conservative tendencies could be discerned in both periods. By the turn of the 20th century, the nature of the debate among French historians on the French Revolution changed under the impact of socialist perceptions, which had been developing during the 19th century. After the First World War, the debate became a more and more clear-cut confrontation between socialists and non-socialists. This latter is the only framework that is meaningful as far as the Russian Revolution is concerned. Should I continue, or you want to?
Yeah, any questions or comments about that section? Okay, go ahead, Sharon.
I just think it's so wonderful how he was able to really take this and really point out so clearly how historians are so impacted by the outside environment, the moment, the present moment, and his ability to unearth all this and talk about it in the way he did. That's all.
Yeah, this whole notion of disinterested scholarship, sometimes it's used against, left scholars, scholars from oppressed communities. But what is often overlooked is the inherent bias of those who represent the ruling class, of course. They bring their own bias to these historical questions. So just to dismiss, for example, the Russian Revolution as tyranny or dictatorship really is a clear distortion of the actual history of Russia and the historical development of the world socialist movement. So, these developments require, a much more rigorous approach, in regard to their study. But go ahead.
A chronological categorization to a great extent obscures the emergence of fundamental ideological differences in the interpretations of major historical events. The English Civil War of the 17th century, which often competes for the title of revolution, is a case in point. It is entirely justifiable to distinguish between the predominantly religious, constitutional, and economic interpretations that have arisen at various times since the 17th century among historians reconstructing the English Civil War. In doing so, however, one or two Marxist views are brought in on the fringe as exhibits of how wide and exotic historical interpretations can be. But Marxist conclusions start from such a different premise, start from such different premises that they constitute a camp apart from all other interpretations, which share much more in common. Okay. From a Marxist viewpoint, in effect, there are only two worldviews that enter the picture. French, in the case of the historiography of the French Revolution, in spite of the more recent evolution, there is still confusion as to the order of difference between several interpretations. That is to say, it is still fashionable to list liberal, in quotes, theirs, the conservative, in quotes, Taine, the social democrat, I think it's Juarez, and Marx himself, or the Marxist Sobul, I don't know how to say that word, as though the differences of degree and kind are more or less constant as one takes each of these writers in turn. That is the equivalent of a taxonomy which presumed the same order of difference between sheepdog, wolf, cat, and lion. Should I go on?
Yes, go ahead. Read another chapter, and then we can discuss it.
Okay. The Russian Revolution, which broke out in 1917, is virtually a contemporary event. The sorts of changes that took place in the manner in which this event has been presented over time are not yet very significant. Any overview of the literature on the topic must use compartments based on differences of approach among historians and other social scientists, viewed virtually or as single generation of writers. This compartmentalization can be done on a purely subjective basis, as evidenced by James Billington's article, 6 Views of the Russian Revolution, in which he is solely concerned with subjective attitudes such as nostalgia, regret, and notions of glory. However, the division reflecting the social reality of the contemporary world is that between Marxist and bourgeois views. When this is overlooked, it suggests an extreme case of mental confusion, since the Russian Revolution itself did more than any other historical event to bring about ideological polarization on a world scale between two worldviews of the socialist and capitalist systems. Before the Russian Revolution, oh, should I stop?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Before the Russian Revolution, the world at large shared the metaphysical conception, in quotes, of which Chairman Mao Zedong speaks in the opening epigraph. In Europe, the metaphysical conception took the form of bourgeois idealism, which had largely superseded the more overtly metaphysical views that had dominated Europe's perception of man and nature during the feudal epoch. Outside of Europe, metaphysical views with a highly religious and anti-scientific content predominated. In such a context, the materialist conception was partially and inadequately grasped. Nevertheless, in the form of clarified by Marx and Engels, the materialist worldview was accepted by a number of individuals in the latter part of the 19th century. With the rise of the Soviet Union, Marxism was to acquire a class base and the support of a state power. Later, other states were to follow this lead through revolution.
Sorry for, excuse me.
Yeah.
I'm lost. Did we skip a page?
No.
Could have.
This Amazon, it says here, the Amazon book preview skips page 7 and 8 for some reason. Maybe because they don't want you to be able to do this.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Yeah, sorry. I considered interrupting, but I just let it go. But after page 6, we get, I was just listening to her.
Okay.
Yeah, because Sharon's reading from her own text. So
yeah, I guess. Apparently so.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, in terms of the existence of socialist countries, the USSR and later China, for example, he points out that how this gave a material basis and a class basis for Marxism, which of course gave it a lot more weight, a lot more clout. If there are examples that can be pointed to, real life examples of socialist construction, it's a lot more powerful rather than being in the realm of contending for state power or in the realm of contending ideas and ideologies. So I think he's raising the question of the influence, the impact of the influence of the existence of socialist states on Marxism as an ideology itself. That's how I interpreted that section. Any other comments on that section? Well, let me just read the last section on 7. Yeah, let me just read that. It says, the rise of states governed by Marxism sharpened the contradictions between socialist and bourgeois ideologies, producing an ideological war for the possession of the whole world. The writing of history has been a facet of and a weapon in that war, and historians interpreting the Russian Revolution itself have been active combatants. In analyzing the alignment of different historians, it is easier to start with the Marxist camp, which is more readily recognizable because it is self-declared. Foremost in that camp are the Soviet historians. To the outside world, and especially to the non-specialists, the names of individual Soviet scholars of the revolution are not well known. Their works in foreign languages were almost invariably joint productions under the aegis of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union or the Soviet Academy of Sciences. However, it does not in the least defeat or our purpose to recognize the collective personality that the Soviet writers have assumed. Any history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, any text on the Russian Revolution, any biography of Lenin or Stalin produced at any time in the Soviet Union can be fairly regarded as the official Soviet view at that particular time, rather than purely personal and perhaps eccentric expression by a single writer. It is only reasonable that Soviet historians should receive priority in a study of the historiography of the Russian Revolution because they are interpreting national history. They have been closest to the most relevant source materials, and they are trying to make sense of a reality that they themselves have experienced and are still experiencing. Very important point. In order to understand the actual history of the Soviet Union, China, and the efforts to construct socialism in those states, of course, we have to go back to the actual literature produced by those forces themselves. It's very, very important to acknowledge that, particularly being here in North America, because we see a lot of people here who write their own interpretations of various things that take place throughout the world. Sometimes they are relevant, and sometimes they have very little connection with what is actually going on in the world or in those particular specific circumstances. So I think it's very important for us, for example, in today's work, to read the Cuban press, to read the Chinese press, to read the South African press, for example, because you get a different perspective than you would get in reading the New York Times about China or reading the Washington Post about China, for example. So categorically, most interpretations of the Russian Revolution that in a university, in a high school setting, typically are negative interpretations of it. Either it's not dealt with at all, particularly now since the Soviet Union no longer exists over the last nearly 30 years. But whatever, even on a university level, a lot of the interpretations that you get are quite negative. And interestingly enough, even by some left scholars who criticize the history, certain aspects of the history of the Soviet Union and China, even contemporary affairs in China and Cuba under the guise of Marxism. Yeah, we see it, happening quite a lot, particularly here in North America. So any comments or questions about anything we've read or discussed so far?
Jerry has his hand up.
Go ahead.
I don't know if he's still got something to say. You there, Jerry?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I muted myself. I unmuted myself. Part of why I think it's so important to read this work now is that if you read the literature that's advanced by the ideological leaders of like DSA and the social demo, all this whole social democratic current, what they do is they completely write off the Soviet Union. And they write it off without looking at the real history of the Soviet Union, what was able to be accomplished in the Soviet Union through planning, the development of the material forces in the Soviet Union in the midst of a lot of which was done during the Depression in the US, the ability to develop a technological society where jobs were guaranteed, healthcare was guaranteed, housing guaranteed, where the kind of grinding poverty we see was completely eliminated. They completely write off that history. They'll write these works on the Soviet Union, and they never mention any of that. All they talk about was that the Soviet Union was authoritarian, and that's what they say, that people were killed under Stalin, the Soviet Union was authoritarian, and it proves, and the thesis that comes from that is that revolution is impossible. And that really the best you can really fight for is the reforming of the capitalist system. That's why I think it's so important, because that's what they're trying to inculcate in the minds of young people who are interested in socialism, is the idea that socialism has never been accomplished and cannot be accomplished. Where in fact, the history of the Soviet Union runs completely contrary to that. What they were able to accomplish as an isolated socialist state in a country that had a very lowly developed material base in terms of the base for capitalist relations was actually pretty remarkable. And they write off China in a similar way by simply denying the gains of China in an even more blaring way, because China is a living organism, and they really write it off what's really going on in China through distortion. But I think what facilitates from them is their attack is on the Soviet Union. And of course the Soviet Union, because the leaders of the Soviet Union were the Bolshevik Party and were communists, it's a way for them to attack the whole idea of communism and to put forward that really the communism is ridiculous. They're against communism, Leninism, and really what they're against is the idea of overthrowing the state. And you're left with the idea of reforming capitalism. That's why I think it's important to take the time to, and why this work is so important. And because it was written, of course, from someone from the developing world who saw what a country that had been the weak link in capitalism had been able to do in terms of its own development. It gave a signal to what could be developed in many other countries as well. But that's why I think this work is important. And you can't ignore the history of the Soviet Union. That's what because if you ignore it, you play into their hands, because they're not ignoring it. Every writing you find from the Jacobin to these ideologues is an attack on Lenin and an attack on the Soviet Union. Every one of them. And we have to be able to answer it if we're going to win over youth to a communist ideology, who are ready and able to be won over, but are being blinded by this bourgeois ideology put forth by those who call themselves socialists.
Yeah, I think that's important, because even Bernie Sanders, what I was disappointed about his reaction every time it was brought up that he had made a statement commending the healthcare system in Cuba or the educational system in Cuba, he'd have to come back and say, well, Cuba is authoritarian. We condemn that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's absurd. I mean, here you have a country that was, in essence, a colony of Spain, a neo-colony of the United States that organized a revolution to overthrow a neo-colonial puppet regime. And within a few years, they were able to institute reforms that went further than the United States have gone in terms of outlawing racism, nationalizing the key industries inside the country, teaching people how to read. Literacy is very important. We just had a settlement in a case here in the state of Michigan around literacy, and it's still not clear how it's going to be implemented. So for that, you know, to say that Castro and the current president, Miguel Diaz-Canel Bermudez, is authoritarian, or to go even to say, to criticize Venezuela and say that the president of Venezuela is a vicious tyrant, and they're under attack by the United States, to me makes no sense. And you even undercut, you know, potential alliances and also the normalization of relations with these states. Even if you do get elected, for example, and you take power and you have the same attitude towards Cuba, towards China, towards the DPRK, et cetera, then, you know, it's not a fundamental shift in foreign policy. And I would venture to say even domestic policy, it's not a fundamental shift. So yeah, this is very, very important that people get away, you know, from that type of analysis. And it even took place during the time of the Russian Revolution. I mean, people like Karl Kautsky, for example, did not support the Russian Revolution, criticized the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks under the guise that and Rodney gets into this later in the book, under the guise that it was not democratic. So, you know, these are contradictions that we have to deal with in terms of people who identify themselves as socialists in North America. And it raises a tactical question for us. How, you know, how do we work, you know, with these forces? 9 times out of 10, they're not going to come forward to support Cuba. In most cases, they will not defend China. So, you know, it's a very good analysis that we need to continue to develop. Anyone else have any comments?
I just want to say that I wish that some of my friends, Democratic Socialists and other people would read the first 7 pages of this book, because it's funny, I was thinking about a very specific instance where I'll send somebody something from CGTN or some Chinese, and they won't even watch it, or they'll think, even YouTube has a thing underneath anything on CGTN that says this is from the Chinese government, you know, implying obviously that you shouldn't listen to it. But you know, I mean, he's laying out very clearly, and especially for somebody who identifies as a socialist in any way, that from his perspective, and he's not even Russian, but he's African, and saying he's laid it out. I don't have to go back through it, but he's laid out why you should listen to them directly and see what they're saying. So I already, the first 7 pages is great. I'm happy.
Right.
And then Tova has her hand up.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for all this, Abiyumi. I think it's really important and helpful, this whole perspective. And I just wanted to relay an example of why it's important from something I experienced out here in the Bay Area. And it was a group I'm involved with that was trying to do some Marxist study group, okay? And it was consisted of team members who are not necessarily socialist or not socialist, considered, or at least one member was actually anti-socialist in this group. And anyways, so the person who designed the study, unfortunately, chose for the very first reading Engels on the family, private property, and the state, which from a strictly pedagogical viewpoint, is an excellent work. But from the language used in that work, it's awful. And it uses things like savages and all these awful references, and of course speaks in the male pronouns exclusively as well. But more importantly, just constant references to, uh, you know, um, I forget all the terms used, but they were awful terms referring to the third world countries and things like that. That would turn off anybody who, in this modern day and age, might be curious about Marxism, Leninism, and it's really an unfortunate way to introduce somebody to the theory. Uh, Dottie Ballin had actually written Feminism and Marxism as a modern update to Engels, where and that's available in a pamphlet, where she excluded that awful language and updated it at the time. She probably wrote it in the, I'm guessing, early 80s or something. I can't remember exactly when she wrote it, maybe even before then, maybe late 70s. But it was, during a time of a lot of uh, activism in the women's movement, and she tried to distinguish the Marxist approach in that as well. But she kind of summarized his Engels' work, but putting it in contemporary language that was more readable, and certainly excluded all that awful language. And since then, there have been other works that updated even further. For example, Leslie Feinberg did an update relating to trans and LGBTQ people taking off from where Dottie Ballin had left. But you can't, people can't learn when the first words that they read in a work are so unfriendly to, and averse to everything that we now know and understand. And anyway, I'll leave it at that. But that, to me, that's one reason this is so important.
Yeah, I think it's important that people understand the period in which those books were written, and the overall thrust of that work. I think is important because it challenges the notion that the first institution in human society was not the patrilineal patriarchy, but was the matrilineal clan. Based upon the work that Henry Morgan had done, anthropological work, which Engels used. Yeah, but yeah, I think it's important, and there's a lot of work now by scholars, from Asia, Latin America, Africa, Black communities in the United States that has, for the last century or more, attempted to correct or even update, dialectical materialist philosophy and thinking, even approaches to history in general. And that's why in the first pages of this book, Rodney talks about how African history, of course, is his specialty, but he also developed courses in other areas because he's bringing the African perspective to developments in European history as well as Asian history as well. So that's very, very important to digest as well. Any other comments or questions? I wanted to read a few more paragraphs from this, and we got about another half hour. Any other questions or comments on this? We're on page 8, the first full paragraph where it says outside of the Soviet Union. Can people see that?
Does anybody have actual text on their screen that they can share? Because I can't share.
Okay.
I don't have it.
Yeah. Well, I can just read it. People can listen.
Fine
I
with
just
me.
want to read. It's a lengthy paragraph. I think it's important, and we can discuss this. He says, outside the Soviet Union, a number of Marxists have also produced conclusions substantially in accord with those in vogue in the Soviet Union. And yeah, I think that's important to recognize too, because I used to get a lot of literature from the USSR, you know, back when it was in existence. They used to distribute it for free, you know, in this country, Progress Publishers, Novosti Press, and so forth. And they had it was a Soviet Academy of Sciences. They also had specialists in African affairs and Asian affairs and so forth. And there was a lot of literature available from the Soviet Union. There was also a lot of literature available from China as well during the 60s and 70s. Peking Press, there were different bookstores that distributed those works and so forth. So there was, among people who were active, if you were interested in finding out, you know, about the Soviet Union from an ideological perspective and China, information was available for people to access. Now, a lot of that information is online. You can still read the Chinese newspapers and journals. You know, you can still read the Cuban, various Cuban publications, Grandma International, and many of the others, which are in English, if you don't speak Spanish, and you know, they'll give you a good view of not only what's happening in Cuba, but also the views of what's happening in different parts of the world. For example, Cuba's relationship with China, their relationship with other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, the work they're doing around the COVID-19 pandemic and so forth. Okay, the second sentence in that paragraph says, most supporting interpretations were written not by professional scholars, but by people who had ideological affinities with those who had firsthand knowledge of the revolution. One of the most famous contemporary accounts was that of John Reed. That famous book, whose memoir, 10 Days That Shook the World, received the imprimatur of Lenin himself. The publication by the American labor unionist William Z. Foster, who was also, at one time, he was the Secretary General of the Communist Party in the United States for many, many years, was also in the same vein. And it was written after a visit to the Soviet Union in 1922, probably during the, I think that was the 4th Congress of the Communist International. However, in the Western world, much of the early enthusiasm for the Russian Revolution died out within a short time. That seems to be one of the key reasons why few major scholarly Marxist studies have been carried out in the West on the Russian Revolution from an entirely sympathetic viewpoint. A well-known example is Christopher Hill's biography of Lenin, written as long ago as 1947. Since then, a number of articles and monographs by the English Marxian economist Maurice Dobbs have had a virtual monopoly of the role of the pro-Soviet interpretations in the Anglophone world. Most Western Marxist interpretations of the Russian Revolution and the Soviet regime range from mild criticisms to bitter denunciations. This started at the period contemporaneous with the outbreak of the revolution in 1917. As part of the debate among European Marxists concerning tactics, strategy, and the fundamentals of Marxism. Inside of Russia, the Mensheviks provided the major dissident Marxist force. Their later writings constitute a self-declared Marxist interpretation that is often diametrically opposed to the equally self-declared Marxist position officially endorsed by Soviet historians. Now, this is interesting because we just talked about a lot of people in the social democratic movement and people who have written often for Jacobin magazine. And so they could probably be considered the Mensheviks of today. I don't know, what do people think? I don't know. in a certain, just to simplify it. He says one acceptable piece of Menshevik historical writing is that of Raphael Abramovich, a prominent figure in the Menshevik hierarchy in the period before 1917. Karl Kautsky, I'd mentioned this before, and Rosa Luxemburg, two of the most prominent Marxists on the European scene at the time of the 1917 revolution. And people know Rosa Luxemburg was from Poland and then Germany, and was killed after World War I, after the revolution was defeated in Germany. It says, two of the most prominent Marxists on the European scene at the time of the 1917 revolution took issue with the Bolsheviks. Their disagreements are in fact part of the history of that period, but they must be considered within the context of Marxist scholars commenting on the Russian Revolution. In the first place, one of the crucial issues of the historiography is that concerning the application of Marxism as theory of the program of revolution and reconstruction in Russia. Both Kautsky and Luxemburg have a contribution to make in that respect. Secondly, their works have been republished and integrated into subsequent debate on the nature of the Russian Revolution. Then he goes on to say, with regard to Leon Trotsky, there's a similar situation of contemporary debate leading directly to subsequent historical controversy. Trotsky began writing historical and political accounts before his departure from the Soviet Union. That part of his work written at the time, and even subsequently, which dealt with the period before 1924, does bear considerable resemblance to the official Soviet versions. But of course, when Trotsky writes of the period when he was Stalin's foremost antagonist, the gap between his interpretation and that of the Soviet historians is virtually unbridgeable. Trotsky was not just a participant at the center of the Russian Revolution, but a historian in his own right. He was also the founder of the Fourth International and attracted a considerable intellectual following. The work of the, quote, Trotskyists, unquote, both in the form of pamphlets and full-length historical interpretations, constitutes a body of literature that is distinctive and has to be dealt with separately in a study such as this. He says, apart from Trotsky and the Trotskyists, and I'm on the top of page 10, many other Marxists fell out with the government and the party of the Soviet Union. There's been a common thread uniting the published work of a larger number of defectors from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, as well as ex-members of the communist parties in the West. Their shared disillusionment is well brought out in the left-sided compilation, The God That Failed. In some instances, these ex-members of communist parties have become apostates ideologically. But in other instances, they claim to continue to make their criticisms of the Russian Revolution from a committed, initially Marxist standpoint. This is to group them with all others with sufficient reason to profess to share the materialist world outlook. And the scant attention which will actually be paid to that particular approach in this study is due solely to the fact that most of their literature relates to the period following upon the Great War started by the capitalist powers, while the limit of the Russian Revolution is here taken to be the eve of that war. Any comments on that? In terms of how we approach even Marxist historians who are critical of the Soviet Union and policies in the Soviet Union, for example, after 1924, for example, or even after 1917, 1918. You know, it's a very, very important point that he's discussing. Any comments or suggestions on how do we interpret that? We don't have an interpretation. I think we do. I think we do. Yeah, I think we have an interpretation. One, of course, is not to play into the anti-communism and anti-Sovietism that is so prevalent in American historical studies or US historical studies, or in political discourse, for example. The same thing today with China. You know, I was watching a campaign commercial for the US Senate. Gary Peters, who's a Democrat, who's running for re-election against, I think his name is John James, who's a Black Republican. And the commercial I saw last night, and he attacks China in the commercial. You know, that the US shouldn't be dependent upon China for critical medical supplies and whatever. So I thought that was quite interesting that here you have Trump. If you watch Trump's briefings, the White House coronavirus task force briefings at the White House, he had one yesterday. You know, routinely he attacks China. He blames China for the pandemic, for the 1.4 million COVID-19 cases in the United States. He continuously does this. And it's interesting to see, here you have a Democrat who's part of the Senate where the Democrats are a minority. And this Democrat, of course, in a campaign commercial is showing that he doesn't support China and he's going to be tough on China in the US Senate. So, Saints, what I'm trying to say is that we have to be careful. We're not saying China is a perfect society or they have a perfect system. But if they're being attacked routinely by both leading capitalist parties inside the United States, we need to think and we need to calculate in terms of how we view and what we have to say in regard to developments in the People's Republic of China. So any other comments on that?
Jerry?
Yeah, there's a couple points. One is one thing people should note is that in this book, he devotes a whole chapter to Trotsky's writing on the history of the Russian Revolution, really as being the seminal writing on it. So it's one of the few works that doesn't collapse into the kind of, I mean, most Trotskyist writings and most interpretations of Trotsky really vilify Trotsky, including by the Trotskyists. And I think what was one of the things that's significant about this work is he actually devotes a whole chapter to Trotsky's as really the preeminent historian on the Russian Revolution itself. And and the book is tremendous. The other thing I would just say is I think he has a really good chapter in the book where he goes over what was accomplished through socialist planning. And I think this is so important now because, you know, look at what we're going through. We're going through this epidemic, which shows the utter chaos of capitalism, the lack of planning and the lack of ability to deal with a crisis because everything's rooted toward the private market and the private enterprise. And you have to be and their answer to that is that's how it has to be. That's the way it has to be. That's the only way to move forward. Even Moore's book, even Moore's movie, the critique of that movie from my point of view was that it said basically it left people with a cynical view. It criticized the so-called environmentalists as being, many of them being beholden to bourgeois interests, but then it left no alternative. So it ends up with overpopulation. Instead of saying planning, it offers an alternative. And I think that's what, as we as communists, we believe that history, when you eliminate the capitalist system and you eliminate private enterprise, that humanity can plan free from the profit system, and that it unleashes unlimited potential for development that we've never seen. And the Soviet Union was a glimpse of what could be accomplished because it was in a country that was extremely poor and it was able to raise itself to really the second most industrial the country in the world, from really the equivalent of where India was when it began, because of socialist planning and without capitalism. It did it without capitalism. One of the things about China that they try to, deny in China is the role of the state now. They try to, well, China's development is because of capital, because of the capitalist sector. But in fact, China's development is despite that capitalist sector to some degree, and that the capitalist sector has been able to be controlled by a state that operates with planning. And I think these are really important notions because they go to the essence of what a revolution is all about and what a revolution can accomplish. And whatever critiques we may have of policies that developed in the Soviet Union and some of the actions of the party, those critiques always begin first and foremost with a defense of what the Soviet Union showed could be accomplished through socialist planning and through a socialist country. And you got to remember, they were doing this when they were the only socialist country. They were invaded by the rest of the capitalist world, isolated by the capitalist world, and having to keep right up till the end, the economy was distorted. They had an economy, I read one time, their economy was about 30% the size of the US, but they had to keep a comparable military because, of the military buildup. So imagine what that did to the Soviet Union, keeping a bloated military buildup in a country with a 1/3 the size of the US economy. And just look at what the military buildup done to us. So anyway, I just think that's really important, why this book is so important. And he's got a great chapter where he goes, it's an answer to all those who vilify the planning and what was accomplished in the Soviet Union, where he lays it out. I mean, the 30s, part of why there was a big communist movement in the 30s is while the capitalist world was in a depression, the Soviet economy was going 15% a year. It was developing with hell's bells because it was in the middle of a 5-year plan and they were industrializing and putting everybody to work. And it was such a beacon to workers all over the world to what could be accomplished. And I think we need to not reject that beacon, and we need not to reject that history if we're going to ever move forward to communism. We can't deny our own heritage and our own history.
Any other comments?
David?
Yeah, I haven't read the book, so I can't plan forward, but I am impressed already with his familiarity with the various trends in the Marxist, semi-Marxist writers, and his willingness, in fact, demand that all of these be studied while at the same time taking account of where they may be coming from, having certain interests, such as those who have ex-members of the Communist Party. And the reason that that's impressive is because I've met so many so-called radicals today, well-meaning or not, who really are not familiar with any of these trends. And so they'll be followers of Trotsky, and I don't think they know a thing about Trotsky. They may be followers of Stalin and glorifying Stalin and know nothing about Stalin. And I might say, by the way, that he hasn't mentioned this yet, but some of the documentation from the revolution period, and especially after Lenin's death, some of that those documents have been suppressed and not available, or very difficult to find available. But there are people who promote China, and so radicals who but they don't know the history of the many struggles inside China from the very beginning. In fact, the struggles between China and the Soviet Union at the very beginning and a little later on. So this is really important because we want to encourage people to read everything, but you have to read it with some guidance, some knowledge, and understanding of where things are coming from. Otherwise, you just can't interpret it in any serious way. That's all.
Yeah, these are very important suggestions in terms of how we approach the history of the Soviet Union. Also, in terms of the whole situation involving China, as I mentioned before, both parties are highly critical of China. Obviously, they are threatened by China. They see China as a principal competitor as well as adversary to US imperialism. And that should give people pause in regard to their analysis around China. Also, what I found interesting as well in Rodney's approach to this is that he actually, as David alluded to, he actually goes back and reviews a lot of the literature of that period, which means that a lot of that literature was available at the University of Dar es Salaam during that particular time period, which is telling. I read James Foreman's autobiography. It's called The Making of Black Revolutionaries. It came out back in 1972. James Foreman was a leader of SNCC in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he was also in the leadership of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and the Black Workers Congress. He lived here in Detroit back during the late 60s, early 70s. But anyway, in this book, his autobiography, he talks about how he went to Tanzania in 1967 and he met Walter Rodney. And he talks about how the Chinese had a bookstore, a Marxist bookstore in Dar es Salaam, the capital of Tanzania. And he remarks in this book how refreshing it was to be in a major city where they had a bookstore exclusively devoted to Marxist, Leninist literature. What was interesting about the University of Dar es Salaam during that period, as I mentioned earlier, is that they had a lot of scholars there who considered themselves Marxists, and they were engaged in a lot of research and debates, and a lot of this has been written about, but some of the material is very hard to find because they issued a lot of publications. For example, there was a journal called African Review, which was put out by a group called the African Association of Political Science. It was formed, I think, in 1971 or in the early 70s. Walter Rodney was a co-founder of that group. I don't think they even exist anymore. They did exist in the 80s and a little bit in the 90s because I used to read their material. But those journals, they're very difficult to find now. They have not been digitized. There are some articles that Rodney contributed to those journals that are available. I've reprinted some of them on the Pan-African Newswire blog, a while back. But there were also other things that were done, pamphlets. The book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, was actually published by the Tanzanian government. So a lot of that material, we really don't have access to it broadly in this country. So the more we advance in terms of digital technology, the better. We can find a lot of these primary source documents now, like Marxist.org, for example. It's a great resource on the history of Marxism, not only in Europe, but in Russia and the Soviet Union. They have documents from all over the world. And they also have a lot of stuff on the left movement in this country. Whether it's the Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the whole history of a lot of different political tendencies that developed in North America as well. So I think now there's a far less excuse that people have for not delving into these issues thoroughly and using terms like Trotskyists and Stalinists, not from a political definitive perspective, but more or less as a slander. I see it a lot in social media. They'll call somebody a Trotskyist, or they'll call somebody a Stalinist, but what does it really mean? And here we are in the third decade of the 21st century. And you ask those people, and they probably can't even tell you what it means themselves. And this is the tragedy of it all, you know. And people who define themselves, for example, as Marxists or Maoists, but they do very, very little work, practical work. Like, for example, this campaign that we have now around Cuba medical assistance to Detroit. It would be great if some of the democratic socialists in the city would take up this demand. But unfortunately, some of them are very hostile to Cuba. Hostile to the point where, you know, they don't even want to recognize any contribution that Cuba has made to its own people and to the world. And from the perspective of somebody who has been involved in activist politics for years, all of us, we know better than that, way better, that Cuba has made profound contributions. The Soviet Union made profound contributions to world peace, to independence movements, national liberation movements, and even to the acquisition of civil rights, human rights here in this country. The fact that there was a Soviet Union, the fact that there was a People's Republic of China, the fact that there is a Cuba gives pause to US imperialism. In the 1950s, 1960s, the Soviet Union had a pro-civil rights position. So did China. China wrote statements in support of the African-American civil rights movement and Black liberation movement. Several statements. We've written about those. 1963, Mao Zedong made 2 statements. In 1968, he made a statement after the assassination of Martin Luther King, and when cities were in rebellion across the United States in 1968, he made a statement in solidarity with the African-American struggle. So, you know, we have to understand this, and it's very, very important. In North America, if we consider ourselves to be revolutionaries, we have to be very conscious of how we criticize other states, socialist states, even national liberation movements, and the context in which we make our criticisms. Because the last thing we want to do is to, you know, support US imperialism and racism and national chauvinism. There's plenty of that out there already. The 2 leading capitalist parties do a lot of it. So it's no need for us to join in with them and start condemning socialist and revolutionary governments, national liberation movements, and even those who are not revolutionary. We still have to be tactical as well as strategic in our approach in dealing with developments throughout the world. So I think we read the first 10 pages of this book, and we could take up the book in future classes. We may want to select certain chapters in regard to the book, or we may want to read it chapter by chapter, like we did with How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. We also did that with State and Revolution by V.I. Lenin and so forth. So anyway, any other questions or comments on today's discussion and work? People can get this book. It's widely available through Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and so forth. And, you know, I would encourage people to order it and read it. You know, just read the actual book first, and then maybe you can go back and read Kelly and the other gentlemen, because they are really not activists, they're not organizers, and their frame of reference is within an academic setting. So, you know, we need to read the actual historian himself, somebody who actually sacrificed their own life, you know, for what they believed in, who could have, After he left Tanzania in 1974, he was offered a faculty position in his home country in Ghana. And Rodney went back to Ghana. When he got there, the position he had been offered had been rescinded at the university. So he didn't have a job in Guyana. So most people probably would have left. He could have gone back to Tanzania. He probably could have gotten a teaching position in Canada or the United States or somewhere else. Because he was a visiting scholar at the University of Michigan for a semester in 1972. I have a paper he presented at the University of Michigan. It was republished years later in a magazine. But yeah, he was there in 1972 as a visiting scholar teaching, and because Ann Arbor was a pretty radical place back in those days, so he probably had a pretty big audience for his lectures and classes during that particular time period. But he stayed in Guyana after he was denied a faculty position, and the Prime Minister, Forbes Burnham, who also considered himself a socialist, he headed the People's National Congress, which was the ruling party in Guyana. Guyana was country, has less, at that time had less than 1 million people, about 800,000 people. And Rodney formed his own political party to challenge the PNC, the ruling party. And this brought him into direct conflict with Forbes Burnham, and he was assassinated in 1980. It'll be 40 years next month. 40 years, it's amazing. He was killed on June 13th, 1980. He was killed by a bomb. But even though he perished nearly 40 years ago, his ideas still resonate internationally. You read these writings. I mean, this stuff is 50 years old, and it's still compelling, and it's still relevant to the contemporary situation that we're facing right now. So if there are any other comments or questions, otherwise we can wrap up.
I put a link to download the book for $3. I don't know if that's what Sharon had referenced earlier.
$9.99, 3 is a lot better.
Wow.
I'm gonna try it right now and see if it works.
Real deal.
It is just a download though. It's not it's not an actual book.
Right.
Not a physical copy.
Remember to build the meeting Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern time with Comrade Jesus from Venezuela.
Yeah, and that's another good example. I'll say this in closing.
His English is quite good, and
Yeah.
he's a revolutionary Marxist, very clearly.
Yeah, Venezuela is another good example today. We have to defend Venezuela. Venezuela is under attack. They've been under attack for the last 20 years, really, since Chavez came to power, over 20 years. And, you got people in this country who want to criticize Venezuela when they're being viciously attacked by U.S. imperialism. At least 2 attempts in the last year to overthrow the government there, which have been unsuccessful. And that speaks to the support that President Maduro has in Venezuela and the international solidarity with Venezuela, which will continue. Yeah.
Can I suggest, in terms of helping build that meeting, it's really important that people personally invite their Facebook friends to the event, post it on other pages that they're part of, and things of this nature, share it, and join yourselves. I mean, there's people here right now who haven't joined the Venezuela event yet. And the more people unfortunately are followers. And when people see very few people sign up to an event, they won't sign up. The more people they see that actually join it, even though you still have to register using the Zoom link, it's still important to join the Facebook event in order to help build the size of the event and build the enthusiasm for others to join.
Great. Well, we had 13 people today from what I see, which is great. For Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. We usually have our classes like at 5, but we've been having them at 2. So it's 11 in the Bay Area, right? Okay. All right. Nothing else. Thanks a lot for attending, and we'll pick this book up at a later date. All right. Take care.
Thank you so
Awesome. Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Really good.
Bye.
Bye.